Sure. Okay. Let's talk discreetly, structurally. How is it different from the old SAT?
The biggest difference is in our paper SAT, we used to see these long 70, 80 line passages that would be followed by 10 questions. So I would read one chunk of passage and then I would be asked 10 different types of questions on that passage. The digital SAT, the biggest difference is that you get one small passage. It's going to be anywhere between 10, 15, max 20 lines, and you're going to be asked one single question based on that passage. So the biggest difference is length, and because of that, it has become more important to kind of check in with time on the digital SAT.
So how long is overall compared to the previous?
So the digital SAT, it's made up of two sections. So there's a reading writing section and a math section. Each section has two modules. The reading writing modules are 27 questions, 32 minutes each. The math sections are 22 questions, 35 minutes each. So taking the break time, doing all four modules, the exam is around 2.5 hours, which is quite a bit shorter than the paper SAT. So it's a lot shorter, it's a lot faster, it's more condensed. Those are kind of the biggest differences, I would say, with the paper SAT.
And it's all online. It's digital now.
It is.
I assume there is a certain sort of mindset shift, a certain way of taking tests different, or is it very much similar to the paper where it's just, okay, but now we're just clicking the mouse instead of being able to, I guess, annotate on the paper or having to fill in bubbles?
Well, I think the question, I feel like by the time we talk to students who are getting ready for digital SATs, there's no need for comparisons from the paper to digital nowadays because this is all they have to work with. Mm-hmm. The current seniors who took paper, half digital, those are the ones who can see the differences. But as far as what the current freshmen, sophomore, and juniors are dealing with on the prepping for the PSATs and digital SATs, they are taking the digital test that they're more trained to do so.
Sure, that's the only one they get.
More trained to do so, and they're so comfortable taking these sort of examinations on computer, timed exams, and one thing I want to mention about the change of format from paper to digital is that even though students are enjoying the benefit of having a shorter test, we lost the whole transparency on how these tests are scored now. No one really knows how many you can miss to score what. I mean, it wasn't so clear in the paper version as well, but at least there was a raw scale that we could see that you can convert, you can sort of anticipate, right? But now that they don't do, as far as I know, we don't have any question answer services that are released to make you can't really request any sort of test your questions back from what you took, like we did in the old days, right? So shorter test, but scoring, I think there's going to be a challenge just getting over the challenges that most kids have getting over 1500s as there's I think there might have been a more even distribution from 13, 14, 1500, right? But nowadays it feels like there are going to be a lot of kids kind of stuck below 1400 and there are a lot of kids just going way above 1550s now. That's
Well, you talked about modules.
Mm-hmm.
There are 4 modules, I believe, total.
Mm-hmm.
2 for reading, writing, 2 for math.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an upper-lower module aspect to this whole thing.
Right, and that kind of piggybacks a little bit off of what Ted just said about transparency issues. So what the digital SAT has is that it's a module adaptive exam, meaning based on your performance on the first module of either the reading and writing section or the math section, you will be given what is considered a lower module. So if you perform rather poorly or comparatively poorly on the first module, you'll get a lower module. And if you do better on the first module, you'll get the upper module for the second module.
So when we talk about the new SAT being adaptive, it's not adaptive question by question.
No.
It's adaptive module by module, but
right.
only in comparison to the first two modules of each section.
Right.
Okay.
So you still have the liberty of being able to jump through questions, kind of explore the section. There's no penalty for kind of moving around or guessing or moving, going in a different order. It's entirely module adaptive. So whatever you do, and just to kind of talk about the lack of transparency that Ted talked about a little bit, is that we don't actually know what the cutoff for the upper and lower modules are.
There's no information on
that information hasn't been released. And we also don't really know score cutoffs based on upper and lower modules. So it's kind of hard to say, just looking at your reading writing score, whether you got the second upper module or you got the lower module. Maybe you got the lower module but did really well the second module. It's really hard for us to tell right now. The only thing that seems to be one way to kind of guess that we got the second upper module is if you notice that in your second reading writing module, you're seeing what I consider slightly more upper echelon level reading questions. So that's going to be a lot of the inference questions, maybe a lot of function questions, and then less main idea detail questions. So and the structure and purpose questions. So if you see that kind of distribution and you're getting the general feeling that like, oh, this module is quite tough, you probably did very well on the first module, and luckily you made it. You made the threshold to the second one.
And you can get that experience by taking the Bluebook through the SAT app, but you can't do it via their linear tests or PDFs that are online?
Right. So the linear tests just have all 33 questions, which would be that could potentially be in a module. You would have to take the practice test using the app to know if you got, to test the adaptive testing. The only thing is the Bluebook app does not tell you if you got the upper or lower module. So you would not be able to know. But you do get the experience of the adaptive testing.
We did
You're
test
right.
it though. Deanna knows what the upper module and the lower module looks like because we tried many different times, right?
Right.
So she mentioned how there's less main idea detail questions. There's more of inference and command of evidence questions, right? Function questions. So Deanna and I, we tell students that if you are seeing these, like based on like you can sort of guess what numbers are what questions. So if you get function questions around like what's a good number? Function questions right around number 8 or 9, and then you see more inference questions toward I would say 15, 16, 17. That means you have gotten the upper module. Whereas if you're seeing vocab, words and context questions from 1 through 6, 7, I would say this is more likely a lower module. So there is a way to anticipate that.
Yeah, it's not a hard or fast rule, but if you see a lot of vocab questions, it's likely that you are in the lower module.
Yes.
The other kind of sure way is the difficulty of the answer choices of vocab questions. I have seen modules where there are 4 basic vocab questions with quite difficult answer choices. That's a really good giveaway. Usually the giveaway is that if you start seeing main idea questions in the second module, you shouldn't really be seeing those there.
Oh, it shouldn't be there at all? Main ideas?
You really shouldn't be seeing those.
I did realize, so while I'm teaching, main idea questions and detailed questions are significantly easier than the questions about functions and command of evidence and inferences. So finding 2, 3 main idea / detail questions on module 2 would mean that you are on the lower module. Yeah.
Okay, so no real surefire way, but you can
Not
get
really.
a general gist based on the difficulty of the questions. Although both the upper and the lower module will have easy, medium, hard questions, just I assume the distribution is a little bit skewed.
Right.
Okay. Well, if I'm going to start to prep for this SAT, we only have the 6 Bluebook tests and the app. Not really much else. I guess Khan Academy has a little bit of resources there. Will the old SATs help at all?
For the math, I think that they could be helpful. Nothing has changed in terms of the breadth of knowledge that is being tested in the math section, meaning you're being asked the same general information and math concepts. So if you really just need a lot of drills, a lot of practice with the math section, that would be a great place to do that. Writing might be a good place to just check in, make sure you know the rules, you're understanding all the grammar rules. But I don't think that reading will be very helpful because it's just an entirely different situation.
A completely new test in terms
Right.
of studying, understanding, application of skills. So as much as possible, maybe don't base your studying on the old tests.
No.
Just the math, and like Diana said, writing rules. You can still use the Khan Academy writing tutorials as they haven't changed as much. There's just more punctuation questions, more, this new type of questions they call new scope called boundaries, and they involve punctuations and transitions and so on. Well, transitions within. I'm not talking about the transition questions that come out. What was that called? Transition questions on the writing is part of a different category, but the boundaries question is in the writing is heavy with punctuation rules. Those can be checked with ACT English as well as SAT writing from the previous.
The questions that start with as the conventions of English.
All of
Right,
those,
right.
all of those. It's either form, structure, and sense, or the boundaries, either one. And then there's a transition questions at the end. So really 3 different types. But form, structure, and sense can be learned from paper. Boundaries questions can be learned from paper, but as well as ACT English, where there's a lot of punctuation questions. I had 4 SAT reading sessions in 2 weeks. I had 4 classes so far. It is so different from what I expected, and I had to prep so much. Unlike past 10 years of teaching SAT writing, I never have to prep once because it's everything I knew. Reading, I used to prep for the paper versions, and I could remind myself what I'm reading and making marks, and I could leave traces of what I'm reading and doing all that. This one, although it's a linear version, paper version, right? But it requires different set of skills to teach the command of evidence, the inference, and the research questions. I think they're called the synthesis questions, right?
Rhetorical synthesis.
Rhetorical synthesis. Those questions are not SAT reading anymore. It's teaching ACT science, ACT. No, it's like ACT science. It's so much like ACT science. And kids are learning more. They're getting better by reading less and less. So it's kind of, I would say, it's not encouraging good amount of reading to go to college, but it's really just learning where to pick out information. I don't know if that's the right thing to do prepping for college, right?
Well, it's a shorter test as well overall.
Yeah, so it feels very different. How effective is our class right now? I think it's more tractable, at least the amount of work that we give out to students and what we can gauge in terms of their output. It's much more tractable. We can manage it better. But the scariest part about this is that to improve SAT reading, to improve their reading ability, their reading scores, it's harder than doing it on the paper, I think, because it's whether you get it or not kind of thing. For a lot of questions, the inference, the command of evidence, the rhetorical synthesis questions, it's a matter of whether you get it or not. And kids who are slow at it, it's hard to pick it up. And that's the same that goes with ACT science.
Is that it usually a vocabulary word, or is it a skill set?
Well, vocab is always been vocab, right?
Sure.
But it's a skill set issue on top of vocab now. So they have to do with 2 things at the same time, and we can build vocab over time, say 3 to 6 months if they train intensively. But the skill set, there's like 4 components to it. There's a graph you got to be able to comprehend. You have to be able to connect that graph to the title of the passage. You got to read question, and then there's the answer choices, right? So to put everything in one question, one piece, and be able to solve that. The kids who solve these questions can solve under 40 seconds, average. 40 seconds, right? The tougher ones, right? The kids who can't, they can't solve it, period. You give them 5 minutes, they're still wandering around.
There's no elimination. They just are going in circles and circles, reading it over and over again.
Because if you can't extricate there's a step in between question to identifying what you're supposed to find, you get stuck, and then the more you start reading, it gets worse. The
Yeah,
point is you gotta read less.
you talked about this.
I partially agree
Yeah.
with what Ted is saying, and I absolutely agree with everything he's analyzed about the reading section. It's totally true that the first most important thing about this reading section is that the more you read, the more confusing it will be. It is not
Yes.
friendly for reading comprehension-based students. So really, when I teach class, what I always say is the person who wrote this passage did not write it to intend to be kind to you. The point of the passage is not to convey information. The point of this passage is to ask a question. So really what's more important, like Ted said, the new reading comprehension is really a skill-based exam. And what that means is you have to understand, depending on the different question types, what the question is asking you to look for. It's a very different set of information or sentences that you have to look for if you're solving a main idea question versus a function question. It's in class I call it the scope, which is each question requires me to look at a different part of the passage. And the students who are solving it in 40 seconds or less, and you can, is because they have great understanding of what each question type is actually asking me to do. So I half agree with Ted that it's difficult to pick up, but I think it's because it's so formulaic now, students who are willing to pick it up, I think you could. You have to put in the effort to learn it. But I think it's the opposite, where I felt that a lot of paper SAT, especially with the history sections, if you didn't read growing up, and especially if you didn't read classics, you didn't read nonfiction, you didn't read history texts, you could not in 4 months pick up enough skill to get through that passage. You just kind of had to say, I'm not getting the history passages, and learn to do the other ones. So compared to that, I think even if you haven't been reading a whole lot in high school or before, even if you don't spend a lot of personal time reading on your own, I think because it's so skill set heavy, you could definitely learn the ropes of navigating through a reading passage and be successful at the end of the day. But Ted is entirely correct, is that it's a very specific skill set. You have to be hitting those marks.
I think some students might get a feeling that because it's a new test and there's not a lot of transparency and we're still learning about it and still changing to an extent, they might feel like they're guinea pigs, or that they don't feel it's completely fair. What would you say to these students?
I definitely understand that feeling, and it's not entirely unsubstantiated just by looking at the linear versions of the exams. What we currently have, the first 4 linear tests were put out together, and then we, after a couple of months, got test 5 and 6. Now, if you look at test 6 and compare it to any of the first 4, there's a lot of difference in, especially the reading section, in how the question stems are written. So what I mean by question stem is that part of the question that actually asks the question, like which of the following logically completes, or what is the main idea of the text. If you look at test 6 of CollegeBoard's test 6, you'll notice that there's a great more variety in test 6 than there are in test 1 through 4, which means that CollegeBoard is constantly updating, changing, manipulating this exam, and they will continue to in these early years. So you're not wrong to feel kind of like you've been handed the short end of the stick by having to do the SAT here. Sorry. But so there's 2 ways to look at that. One, you might want to ask yourself if you want to take the ACT. That exam is a little more kind of well built and predictable at this point.
Predictable.
And the other question I would ask is, why really the changes and the updates on the digital SAT isn't so big that if you understand, going back to what we talked about earlier, the core skill set for each question, if you understand the navigation tools for looking through the reading section, these small changes as they come up shouldn't be influencing your score that much. So if you are at a point where you feel like the exam isn't predictable and you don't know what's going to come out and it looks different, in the test center versus on the Bluebook exam, it's so different that I can't focus. I would more ask you to go back and say, do you have the foundational skills down? Because I think the less that's true, the more turbulent that difference is going to feel.
Okay.
I think one way to justify the foundations but on the PSAT test or the SATs, just based on my past experiences, if you can score over 650 on either sections, then you do have your foundation set. Whereas if you're scoring below 600 and trying to take the test as soon as possible or set a date that you want to take, let's say like this summer, right? And you have 600, give or take, 10, 20 points, right? And you're looking to take the test in August because you feel like that's a good date. That's just not a smart move, is what I think.
Yeah, I want to talk about the August test a little bit. I think there's this idea that because August is kind of at the end of summer, you had this breadth of time to study. A lot of kids may be really kind of committed to doing the SAT over the summer. You feel like you have to take the August exam because it seems like a natural procession of things, right? You studied over the summer, you take the exam right before fall semester starts or right at the beginning of fall semester because that seems to make the most sense. And it does, but if you're not ready to take the August exam, don't go into the August exam. Right? You don't take an exam because it's there or you can sign up for it. You take the exam when you're ready. And there are a couple parameters for knowing if you're ready to sit the official exam, like Ted just talked about. It's going to be what scores are you getting on your diagnostics? How are the splits coming up, reading, writing versus math? How much more time do you have to work on the SAT? There are a lot of other factors to think about. So just because there is an August exam and just because you can take it doesn't mean you should. You should think about it before you take it or sign up for it.
Okay. That's just because we teach SATs and most of our students have high expectations on what they want to achieve on the SATs, right? So with the type of foundations that we're talking about, we are dealing with mostly students who want to break 1550s and try to get 1600 if possible. And of course, there are students who are scoring thousands and 1100s. And if you want to overcome your first hurdle, maybe break 1350, 1400, I think that could be a plan for students of where their starting scores are in the thousands, right?
We had that discussion about the SAT still changing.
Right.
We talked a little bit about it.
We
but
did.
Bluebook tests 1 through 4 were released all simultaneously for international test takers first, and then eventually for U.S. test takers when the DSAT, digital SAT, went live in the States. They released 5 and 6 about a couple months ago. You have noticed changes.
I have noticed changes. And when I first started, so I've had now a full calendar year and more of teaching specifically the digital SAT. And one thing that was always surefire, 100%, never changed, was that there was a formulaic way. I'm going to go back to kind of what I talked about a little earlier, but there was a formulaic way to identify a question type. What I mean, so the order that a lot of my students would solve the exam is they would read the question stem first, and then they would go to the passage. Because I would say, if your question looks like this, that means we're looking for this information. So, and just to kind of add in a little bit of how I teach class is I teach different question types in 2 different ways. There are a couple questions I'm talking specifically about the reading section. There are a couple of questions where you have to directly find the answer. And there are a couple question types that you will solve through elimination. So because those questions are built different, you have to read them different, right? The questions that you're going to want to look for answers directly, those are going to be the main idea questions, the detail question, and any of the quantitative evidence questions, right? Because those questions, you're going to be able to find the information you need to answer the question in the passage. So once you find it in the passage, it's about matching it with the answer choice that you need to. The other question types, most importantly, the textual evidence questions, the function questions, and the inference questions, or the logically completes questions, you're not going to find the answer in the passage. Why? It's quite simple. I think kids miss it a lot, but it's really simple, which is that those question types are asking you to make some sort of deduction. So the answer is not going to be in the passage. It's going to be outside of the passage. So what you're going to need to do is pick up the important parts of that passage and go find the answer choice that you can draw a line to from the passage. So that's usually how I taught how to approach a reading question. And that's how my students got really quick on solving the reading question. Now, the biggest difference I've noticed in 5 and 6 is that CollegeBoard has started to play around with the question stems, right? So I recently saw a practice question on both test 5 and test 6 that begins with, it can be inferred from the passage that. So if you look at that beginning of the question, most students are going to think that this is an inference question because it has the word infers in it.
Seems reasonable.
Seems reasonable. But if you read the entire question and you read the passage, you will recognize that this is a detail question. Really, what they're asking you to do is, based on the text, what do you know? That is exactly how detailed questions are written. The original detailed questions are written in based on the text or according to the text. It's slightly different wording, but they're asking the same thing. So CollegeBoard is starting to play around a little bit with how they ask the question. So they're asking the same questions. They're giving the same passages, but they're playing around with what words can I use to give this to you and how much more confusing will that be for you? That's the biggest difference I recognized. The other difference I will say is passages are getting a little longer. And especially the literature passages are getting a little longer.
The literature passages.
The literature passages are getting a little longer. So there's one thing that's really important about the length of a passage, because something I always emphasize, and I emphasize every week when I teach class, is you get a minute 15 to solve each question. CollegeBoard makes this question under the understanding that you get a minute 15 to solve this question. So if a passage feels overly complicated or overly long, it's because you do not need to read the entire passage, because it's impossible. The new longer passages are great evidence of that, because it's impossible to read, understand every line, every word, read the question, read all 4 answer choices, and then pick the correct answer. You will not have time. I do not have time to do that in a minute 15 for every single question. So what that means is they're making it intentionally longer because it shouldn't matter. Because you should be finding and looking for information. You should be mining for information. So there's one change that makes it a slightly harder to approach the exam, and there's one change that makes it clearer to us that this is not a comprehension exam. It's not really a reading exam. So it's just more proof that if you work on the skill set, you should have no problem being able to get through these questions.
So that's Bluebook 1 through 4 versus 5 to 6. And I assume
Yes.
as they release new tests, new changes will be found, new approaches, new tinkering tools they've had. My question now is, how has the actual test differed from the Bluebooks in your students' experiences?
So the feedback that I'm getting from students is that there are 2 different feedbacks. We are noticing a pattern of, which used to be true as well, which is if you get an exam with an insanely difficult reading and writing section, both modules, math will be a little easier. That is kind of generally what I'm hearing. Something that I do want to point out about that we're hearing about math is that SAT is not allowed to ask math questions that are not within the list of topics that are written out on CollegeBoard's website. They have a really hard and fast list of topics that they can ask. Now, I have some students who are in the hardest math courses at their high school. Some of my IB students are in IB higher level math, doing quite well, who will walk into a math exam, will come out and tell me, I've seen questions that I've never seen before. And what that means is they can't be changing what they're asking you, so they're changing how they're asking those questions. So we have noticed that with the digital SAT math sections, it's actually the inverse. Reading has become more important compared to the paper exam. It's going to be a lot more about, can you understand text-wise what the situation is and what they're asking you? Do you understand what the question is asking you to do? It's not going to be a simple, have you learned this in school math question? It's a, do you know how to approach this in a mathematical or quantitative way? So that's some of the biggest feedback I have been hearing. And one thing I want to say is kind of feedback I get across the board is that students will walk into the reading section and say, I got this weird physics passage, I got this weird science passage, and it had Latin names, and it had like planets and black holes, and I had no idea what they're talking about. I hear that maybe every other test, at least a couple of kids, which I totally understand why that's confusing. One thing I want to say, and the one thing I stress in class, is that this exam is not built for students with prior knowledge. This exam is not here to test your scientific abilities, your knowledge in the social sciences and econ or psych. You don't need to know any of that. At the end of the day, it's a reading exam. So if a lot of students I think will agree, you'll go into the test, you'll get a passage, you'll read it, and you'll go, what are they talking about? If you're feeling that, it's because you're reading too much. You're reading way too much. So you have to I ask students to come up to the surface. I want you to skim the passage and skim the kind of bare structure of the passage more than read and deep dive into the passage, because it's so confusing. It really is. I mean, you get like Latin names and names of bacteria and like telescopes, and it's not like we talked about earlier. It's not there to make things easier for you or clear for you. So you kind of got to come up to the surface, read it a little more casually, and that will help you kind of navigate those really difficult, those usually are the evidence and inference questions. So those are the 3 points that I think I hear the most often, at least recently.
Have you noticed a difference between kind of the first digital SAT test administrations and more recent test administrations?
It's hard to say that there's a difference between those two, because I think within that time frame there has been so much change, and like August will be very different from October and will be very different from March. So it's kind of, I think it's still, we're very early. It's hard to expect. There isn't actually a pattern in that first year of testing, even in international sites. So I hesitate to say that there's a difference there.
Is the one true constant that at least the first 4 Bluebook tests are much easier than what the SAT will give you?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true, especially for math. We talked a little bit about what's been different with the first 4 linear tests and versus 5 and 6 for reading, writing. For math as well, the same is true. The first 4 linear tests and the adaptive practice on the Bluebook app, very simple, very straightforward questions. So if you are solving the Bluebook app exams, I have a lot of students who are slightly more comfortable with math. They'll solve the Bluebook exam. They'll have like 12 minutes left over. That's usually not a good indicator of this exam, because there is no way smartest kid in high school will go sit the SAT. There is no way you will have more than 10 minutes left over on that section. So the Bluebook is definitely a lot easier, but it's a really great place to kind of test the waters for all of the different things that the exam can ask, especially for the math section. Make sure you have the core understanding of different topics.
Ted, here's a more speculative question for you. You've seen multiple SAT format changes over the years. You've seen them start, people are uncertain, they've evolved, they've kind of stabilized, and then they've changed again. We're still in year like 1.5 now of the digital SAT. Do you anticipate it to stabilize at some point? Do you anticipate any other changes? Do you think this format is here to stay?
Well, the format's going to stay for another, good 5 years from now, but there's going to be a change at least, once after, I would say 5 years, because I think the cycle, the rate of change is actually going from somewhere to 15 years to 10 years to 5.
Do you think it's inevitable?
Well, it's bound to change because you guys have been talking about how, even from the first 4 sets in Bluebook to the last 2 sets, 5 and 6, they have changed, and I call that as, I think that's an evolution of College Board exams, right? And how they do every time. Even if we look back to the old paper SAT when they were first introduced, I think things like this, the first 4 tests they release as versus to the second 4 sets they release, they look drastically different, and students are not going to notice that as much. So
Did they stabilize over time?
I think it just keeps changing. I think
Right.
it keeps changing, right? And I can't say it's getting harder, but it's changing. So some students may feel that math is harder than reading and writing, or reading and writing is harder than math. But one thing I can say about the College Board test, even though the Bluebook is sort of like test version of what the actual exam is going to look like, the test that kids are getting, the students who will be getting in August or October, they're going to be very, very well-made exams that are just apt to test out what kids need to perform in college, right?
And here's the important question. Within a 1.5-year period, which is probably the longest that a student realistically should take studying and taking the exam, you reckon? Do you think there'll be much change within that period?
It's changed over 1.5, right? So
Right.
from now until next year, I would expect there's going to be some change. I think Deanna mentioned that test 5 and 6, that was unexpected from what we've been seeing from the first 4 sets, right? And the questions stem changing. So it's bound to happen again. I don't think the stem's going to change drastically, but at least the angle they approach, how they approach these topics will evolve over time. So students just have to, you got to have good foundations, right? You got to have good foundations. And I think to address how how students can prepare for the upcoming or the test next year and so on, you really have to build solid foundations and know when to take the test.
And those foundations will get you anywhere,
Exactly.
regardless of whether the test changes or not.
you don't. So last year, even the kids who took the very first digital SATs in Korea in March, there are kids who score 1580s, right? And there are kids who score 1240s and so on. So there's a wide range of students who took that. Now, a year after them, the kids who had to continue taking the test, have they improved so much by prepping for a year and a half? We can say it's safe to say that the amount of improvement you can have from where you start, even though there has been changes over a period on the College Board test, the amount of improvement you can have is still very consistent. I think I would say 250 points to 300 points is probably the max you can improve if you're in the 1100-1200 range.
So with the new SAT, now all digital, the PSAT has also been digitalized, computerized, put into the nice microchips. Do you think that the PSAT is still a good indicator of your SAT score?
Most definitely. The SAT scored out of 1600, whereas the PSAT scored out of 1520s. And when you compare, when you go to the educators question database, is that what it's called, College Board? When you go there, you can go through all the questions that are from PSATs as versus SATs, right? The level of difficulty change, the difference between the difficulty levels of the two tests are not noticeable nowadays, except the PSAT is going to have, is it going to have less questions or?
No, it's the same
It's the
format.
same format. Well, there used to be less for PSATs in the paper, but now I guess it's the same format. Okay, so back to whether PSAT is helpful or not, right? When a rising sophomore or when a sophomore student takes the PSATs in October, you'll get your score by December around, or if not November. That score is the key indicator of how you should be approaching your SATs in the future. So that number, how to interpret your reading, writing, how to interpret your math score, and of course, every school has different math curriculum. If you follow the Common Core standards and take the math, let's say you take Algebra 2 in sophomore year, then you will still need to take pre-calculus in junior year to fully prep for SAT math topics. Whereas if you did take the pre-calculus in sophomore year, then you're pretty much ready for the SATs. So given that you took pre-calculus in sophomore year and you take the PSATs, that score, once you receive your score, you can really look up and search around and see when you should be taking your first SATs as a sophomore or junior or even a senior. I mean, it's hard to predict when you're taking senior, but if that PSAT score is going to be very, very important understanding where you stand in the game.
Do you have any score ranges that might be helpful to direct?
It's very subjective, but for our standards, the kids who are, very high achievers,
Yeah.
I say if your PSAT score is over 1350, composite score is 1350, I would say you have a chance to get 99 percentile sometime during junior or senior year in high school. But if you're below 1300, I would say you should investigate which subjects or topics that you're lacking, because a kid could have a 750 in math and a 550 in reading writing, right? That means you really have to spend some time prepping for reading writing. Whereas if you have 650s in both subjects, then I think you'll have a good shot at taking the SATs as early as first semester of junior year.
There's also the 8th, 9th grade PSAT that middle schoolers can take.
There is the 8-9. I don't know if I would say that the 8-9 is a good indicator of SAT readiness in general.
You saw the questions, right?
I have seen the questions. I've taken a look at them. I would say that, like Ted said, the PSAT for sophomores and juniors is quite it's quite on par with the difficulty level of the digital SAT. It is still a little easier and a little simpler, but it's in the same kind of echelon. It's in the same group in terms of difficulty. I would say the 8-9 is just a little too far out, that I wouldn't hesitate to look at your PSAT 8 or 9 score and be able to predict how far or how well you can do on the actual digital SAT. And also, if you're still in the 8th grade, there's still a lot of growth that should be happening, especially, I would say, in the writing section and math as well. So if you are doing poorly on the 8-9, that isn't necessarily an indication that you can't do well on the actual digital SAT. It just means you still have a lot of room for improvement.
Right.
And this is our daily PSA. It is still beneficial to try on the PSAT and get the highest score possible, right?
Yeah. Just because your school is making you take it doesn't mean you should coast it. If you can take it, it makes sense to kind of give it your all and see what you get. One, like Ted said, it's a good indicator of readiness for the SAT.
Diagnostic.
Right, it's a free diagnostic. Well, it might not be free
It might not be
for
free,
everyone,
right.
but it's a good diagnostic. The other thing is that if you're in the States, there are some benefits to taking the PSAT and doing quite well for National Merit Scholars, National Honors. So you might have more opportunities unfold in front of you if you do well on the PSAT. So it's good to take that chance on opportunity seriously, but also don't freak out if you didn't do quite well on it.
That just to add, the NMSQT, the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, that's only applicable for juniors. So if you're a sophomore and you score 1520, you won't get the scholarship. You only get it once you take it in junior year. And you won't, I mean, no senior is going to take the PSATs, right? So junior year level, junior years, when you take the PSAT, it will say it's a PSAT / NMSQT. And sophomores and freshmen, you take it as a practice test. So it won't matter. You know, parents ask, students ask, does this PSAT score stay? Is it going to be sent to colleges? When you take it in sophomore year, it won't be sent. But if you do take it as a junior year, it will stay on your record. And there's a chance that colleges may find out what you had. Sometimes, I mean, there's no kid who's going to get a 1200 on PSAT and then all of a sudden score 1600. That might seem very fishy, right? So junior year NMSQT is what matters, really.
So if you're applying to college and getting ready for college, the big thing is the standardized test, and there are two big options, the SAT or the ACT. If I'm a student, let's say in sophomore year now, trying to figure out which one to take, what should I really focus on? I have no idea what the differences are between the two. I kind of know my strengths, but firstly, what is the big difference between the SAT and the ACT in your eyes? This can be a philosophical question. This could be a structural question.
You know, until last year, when both were 3.5 hours long, you could kind of compare and say, well, ACTs, it's more time pressed, and there's science sections, and it's cut out for people who can read fast. As for SATs, with a paper, there's vast amount of knowledge that you need to have, just if you want to do well, like U.S. history and grammar and so on. But now, speaking of digital SAT to ACTs, okay, it's hard to, you know, kids are choosing the digital SAT route just because it's shorter, right? But I feel like you really should find out what the ACT is like before you make your final decision, because there's still students who are going to be so much better off with ACTs than the SATs.
So take both tests.
Take both, of course. But you know, if you take the 2 hour and 20-minute test as versus 3.5 hour, most kids are going to gravitate toward taking the digital SATs. But we are experts in kind of predicting how kids are going to turn out, what they're going to score at the end. And there are definitely kids who are better off with ACTs than the SATs.
Describe those students.
The kids who read well and they don't, you know, reading. So if you do on your reading section and science section, which is both 35 minutes, you should take the ACTs, because math, if you struggle with, you know, people say there's math and science sections in ACTs, whereas there's only math on the digital SATs, right? If you struggle with math, you got to take the ACT route. Now, if you do well in math, then you take the SAT route. It's as simple as that, from my opinion, for all those years I've been teaching, just because ACT math, you can improve from a 25 to a 35. It's doable. SAT math, if you convert that 25 to an SAT, I would say that's about 550 around, right? To go from 550 to 750, I don't know if that's going to happen. We know within a year or so. So ACT math is very straightforward. You can improve. ACT science is not scientific. ACT science is your readability. So if you can read fast enough and you struggle with math, you go with ACTs. If you're good with math and you struggle with reading a bit, go with SATs. That's as simple as that.
So again, the SAT has 4 sections, 2 reading, writing, 2 math. Mm-hmm. The ACT has English, math, reading, science. And so there's kind of this misconception that because the ACT has math and science, that's half the test, a little more STEMmy, a little more math sciences based, but it's not, because science is mostly reading.
You took the ACTs, right?
I did take the ACT.
Why did you take the ACTs?
It was a shorter test at the time.
Right. Was it shorter than the SATs?
At the time, I think it was about the same, but I liked the fact that the ACT had shorter sections, kind of more rapid paced,
Okay.
and I was
Rapid
a
pace, right.
faster test taker. I always have been, and so that kind of matched my ability a lot more.
I see. So 4 sections cut up in they're shorter in each section.
I kind of like the time crunch and being. I
Right.
had a
You
lot
can
of,
read fast enough.
Yeah, when I
You
took
can
the
read fast
SAT, I had a lot of time left over, and that killed me because it's like, do I do it again or like? Because I got a lot of questions wrong because I wasn't careful enough.
Well, I think ACT is just it's such an efficient test that you can even delete your score. You can mail in a score cancellation form to Iowa. You can get your score erased, or if you end up taking the ACTs 5 times, no college will ask you for a full record of ACTs. They will ask you have the option of reporting scores that you want to report. The ACT now also has what's called a score choice or super scoring system.
Well, let's talk about super scoring then.
Yeah.
Another more practical difference between the two is that it's the score you'll be sending to colleges. There's this idea called super scoring. How is it different between the two tests?
I think it's you have to handle it with some caution, because if you take it 4 times and let's say you score highest of each, you score highest on one section from each of the 4 tests, there's a chance that you'll show colleges that you took the ACT 4 times, which is not very favorable. It's not a good sign that, taking the ACT 4 times, SAT 4 times to colleges won't like that. So I want to tell students that, you should have your ideal score based on maximum of 3 sittings, if not 2, if not 1, right? So SAT doesn't have that super scoring option on their websites. You do that by sending in your test one, or you have score choice. You can send your scores based on, right? Or you can send all scores. ACT literally says your scores are getting super scored, and that's a no-no if you've taken it more than 4 or 5 times. So handle it with care is what I would say.
So the SAT does not have a formal super scoring option.
They don't.
You
They
just
don't.
choose which sittings you want to send to schools.
Right. And colleges will know that when you choose your scores, they'll know that you have sent selective scores, because there's always option of saying all scores or selected scores.
And do colleges know if, for example, you took it 4 times and you sent 3 scores that you didn't score 1, or just that you did not score all of them?
Well, SAT, very few schools, it was half and half back in the days. I would say 5 years ago, half of the schools will ask for all scores. Schools like UPenn or Cornell, they ask for all scores. A lot of others, half of the other schools ask for only score choice, right? But nowadays, sorry, I forgot the question. Colleges will know. Colleges will know how many times you've taken it if you send all score report,
Sure.
right? If they ask for that. But otherwise, they won't know how many times you took it.
How does super scoring work on the ACT then?
It's automatic. They take the highest one of each test. So if you've taken it 5 times and you have a 35 on certain date, they'll just automatically take that. They'll put that as your high score.
So they'll take the highest of each section.
Yeah.
That'll be, and that's the one kind of score they send to colleges.
Yeah.
So automatically, formally in the system, you don't have to do anything.
You don't have to do anything. But I'm saying you can also opt out of that by submitting scores individually. If you send 2 scores individually, you make payment twice. Okay?
But that's an option.
That's you can do that.
Would you ever do that?
Well, in extreme cases where you took it 4 times and I want to send 2 scores and the system already has 4 scores recorded.
For ACT?
Yeah. But if my super score is based on 4 tests,
Yeah.
whereas, so let's say my super score out of 4 tests is 35.
Sure.
And my combined score of 2 tests is 34.5, which is still treated as 35. So should I send the automatic super score or should I submit 2 scores? I will send in 2 scores.
Because the automatic super score colleges see all 4 tests.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah. So, and that's a flag. No college, no top tier colleges will ask, will favor student who's taken the ACTs or SATs more than 3 times. That's just a very general rule from the back days.
Okay. Let's say I started studying for the SAT or the ACT. In what situations would you say you would switch between the two? Or do you make that decision lightly?
Not lightly. Not lightly. I would just say, based on the reading section, because the digital SAT has seen such a drastic change, it's going to be really hard to go from studying the digital SAT reading to going to the ACT reading section. Maybe the inverse would be a little easier, but unless you're making the switch because you feel much better suited for specifically the ACT reading section, I would say that change is going to be a lot different and a lot harder.
That's actually very true. It's if you are switching in middle of your junior year or beginning of your senior year, 2 things. One is it's just not worth it. It's just not worth it. And the second is it's not going to make too big of a difference because chances are, if you're switching because you want to, if you're going from 90 percentile to 95 percentile, that's a big jump from SAT to ACT, which there's a good chance it won't happen. It won't happen, right? And so, and then I have kids, these days I have kids who have taken 3 digital SATs and have a top score of 1540, and they don't like that. They want to get above 1550. They think 1560 is like the ideal score to apply to top 20 schools. I don't know where that came from, but these guys are switching over to ACTs nowadays during their rising senior summer. I mean, they could do well on the ACT, sure, but is that the best way to spend your summer break? I would say no. Okay, so it's very important to find out, like, instead of switching between SAT and to ACT, vice versa, find out your strengths and weaknesses from the start, and then make your decision from there.
Right. Begin with the informed decision.
Right.
Don't make the switch later.
Informed decision it is.
Yeah.
My next question was going to be, what if my first score is really bad? But but if we're giving that advice, we should not talk about that consideration.
Well, I mean, if they're both very bad, it depends on what you mean by.
Okay, no, my question would have been, I started studying for the SAT. I took an official SAT administration, and I did not get the score I wanted. Is that that's probably poor
very
planning?
Possible.
Is that,
Well, no, I mean that happens for students.
Happens for a lot of students.
For a lot of students.
Let me enter that again. Let's say I took the ACT or the SAT. I studied. I thought this was going to be my test. I did the official test administration. I did not get the score I wanted. I got quite a bit lower, and this has nothing to do with, the person next to me had a really loud mouse or it was really hot in the room. I just didn't do as well as I wanted to. Is that perhaps a sign to switch to the other test?
No, so I would say if you begin with either one of the tests, 3 tries is what you should make to, I mean, after 3 tries, you're pretty much done, okay? But if you want to switch over to the other test after the first try, that's just not a wise decision because it means that you weren't fully equipped nor prepped to take your first test. And so
regardless of whether you're taking the SAT or the ACT, you just weren't ready.
Right. So I mean, and most students don't know whether they're ready or not. They take it because, like our students in Korea, they take it because they think August is the time to take before school begins, right? I'm sure a
logical little time right after summer break before you start school studying.
But there's no logical time for SATs. You take it when you're ready. And just a lot of misconceptions about, there's going to be so much, we're going to be so bombarded with schoolwork during fall semester, spring semester, and whatnot. But, statistically proven, students have finished the test date that most students have gotten their final score is either on the August of senior year, which is the right before senior year starts,
Yeah.
or October of senior year, which is so there are more students who's finishing the SATs with their satisfactory scores by senior year than junior year. So all this discussion about, hey, I'm not satisfied with my score. What do I do? I don't have time. Eventually you're gonna have to take it down to August or October of senior year. So no sweat over what your score turns out after first try in junior year, or even kids are taking SATs as early as sophomore these days.
So how early is too early?
It's
It's
entirely
dependent.
personal.
It's
I'm
very
sure.
subjective,
Right.
I'm sure.
but okay, let's just say if you want to get over 1550 and your first test score is 1300s, I would say a fair score to hit 1550 is if you get anything above 1450, you have a shot of getting over that 1550, 99 percentile at some time.
Your cold blind diagnostic.
Yes. But if you're below that, if you're below 14, if you're looking at like 1300 numbers, if you're at 1390, 1380, you gotta wait it out, or you just gotta train yourself. You gotta prep. You gotta learn.
Do you see a difference between students who take a cold blind diagnostic in their sophomore year versus in their junior year?
Big difference.
Big difference.
Big difference.
And that's just from having lived another year, studied another year,
Oh,
having
yeah.
developed
Right,
throughout
right.
school.
That's the whole point of these scholastic aptitude tests, because these aren't achievement tests. These are aptitude tests, right? So, why do they call it aptitude tests instead of achievement tests?
That's what the SAT stands for.
Yeah, exactly. That's what a SAT stands for, and it's always best to take it when you're ready, when you're equipped, when you have learned the materials, and that's usually during junior year. Yeah, I mean, you look at students from Exeter, you look at students from Andover, you look at students from Harvard, Westlake. These are top boarding schools out there. Are they so well educated? Are they better educated that they can take it earlier in sophomore year? In fact, these guys take their first SATs in second semester of junior year. They take their second SATs in senior year first semester, right? So you got to look at these schools that are well educating and see when they take the SATs, because, I mean, the better equipped you are, the less sittings you'll have for these tests. So finish it in 2 tries, right? Without having to worry about, the question about, I totally bombed my exam. I didn't think this was possible, but I received like a, score that I what am I going to do with this? They're just missing a lot of information. Their lack of information on how they're approaching this test. Yeah. Take it when you're ready, right?
Right. But that also goes with saying that to have that conversation, you need to do all of the steps before taking your first official standardized exam. That's doing a diagnostic for SAT and ACT, looking at what you're doing poorly on, looking at readiness to sit an official exam after having had that conversation, and then sitting the official exam and not getting the score you want. Then obviously you need to wait it out. You need to work on it a little more. You need to give yourself more time and space. Absolutely. But if you don't do all of the precursor steps, I would just say that conversation is moot. So always start with the diagnostic steps we've been talking about.
Okay. Theoretical question. I took both the SAT, I took the ACT diagnostic. Both felt about the same. I got similar scores when you look at the conversion. I'm not particularly better at math. I'm just kind
Totally
of
possible.
there. What's the decision making behind that there?
Scheduling, because SAT and ACT has different schedules. ACT, I believe, there's a testing during July and September and October, let's say, right? So if you're starting to prep sometime during the summer, July could actually be a good just trial test, right? And then take your real one in September and finish by then, if not by October. I think those 3 consecutive testing dates are quite ideal for ACTs. SATs, it's all over. It's March, May, June. There's October,
August, October.
November,
November,
December. So there are more tries, attempts you can do toward the fall and winter. So that, depending on whether you play fall sports or spring sports or whether, however your school schedule works out, you should decide by then.
There's also probably a question of availability.
Availability, yeah. If you're international, one exam might be more approachable, or you might have agency to take one exam more over the other. That definitely is a factor. If you're really, I mean, I hesitate to think of an example of a student who is so equally split down the middle, like there's no preference between SAT and ACT. I don't think we really see that. I would just say make sure for the ACT it's faster paced, but it is a longer exam, so make sure you're ready for that stamina. I think that is going to be a big factor, and it's just also very word heavy. Now with the change to the digital SAT, the ACT is going to feel much more word heavy, and it's a different issue from just reading comprehension. It's just having to sit down and look at that many words for over 3 hours. It's a very specific experience. So make sure you're up for that. If your knowledge is really 50-50, you can start to think about the testing experience and what is an environment that you can you think on testing more reliably, do well.